and the integrity of what is and what can be duplicated and what can be recognized. Tracy grew up in a family of mathematicians and scientists. I grew up in a family of farmers, came from a long line of dairy farmers. My grandfather not only ran the farm, he worked construction, and he was in the Great Depression. He was a prize fighter at night. He'd go out and bare-knuckle fight to pick up extra money to make ends meet until my grandmother found out, and then that came to a rapid halt. My father, who was also in the military and a cowboy, he wouldn't pull out his napkin and pen. He would sit us around the breakfast table, and he would count up the livestock. Well, there's this many cows and this many calves, and you've got that many horses out there. And he used to refer to it as heartbeats. He would look at his sons, and I come from a family of all boys, had 2 brothers, quite rough and tumble. He'd say, "You've got 142 heartbeats today to take care of, and I expect you do that." And that's how he would put us to work, with this responsibility, integrity. That's what I love about the researchers. They get that. They know what responsibility and integrity is, and they will hold that line. So it's an honor for me to be here in this company to simply share my experience. Tracy mentioned I have written a couple of books and became a best-selling author almost by accident. I had no intention of being a writer. I had no intention of being a speaker. That was never on my radar. I was an artist. I loved art. I was a creative director at an ad agency. I loved concepts and ideas. But what happened to me many years ago shifted everything, and it has been almost 19 years since I had the accident. And I was speaking to some folks before we got started here, and the accident will become the pinnacle of everything that shifted in my life. My life will forever be before the accident and after the accident. And I'm going to share a little bit about what happened, but it's interesting in doing that. The only reason I ever wrote a book is that I was approached by a publisher. Now, I'll get a little personal. I teach a little Sunday school class on a Sunday morning. And I was even reluctant to share some of the things that had happened to me in that setting. This was many years ago, and I mentioned just a little bit about it. And there was a woman in the back that came up and said, "Hey, gosh, I want to introduce you to a guy at the university, at one of our universities there in Utah." And she said, "He studies these things, these out-of-body or unordinary experiences, and I'd love to have you talk to him about what happened to you." And I was reluctant. After the accident, I didn't speak about it to anybody. I shared it with my closest immediate family members, my brothers. I had shared a little bit with my mom. I hadn't even spoken to my father about it. And I had held it very tight for a couple of reasons. Number one, I didn't want people to think I was crazy. Number two, I didn't know how to share it. How do you articulate something that is unspeakable? But I did reluctantly agree to meet with a fellow who was part of IONS, and Bruce is one of the founders. You started that whole thing. And I shared with him what happened. And he said, "Gosh, you've got to come speak to our group. You've got to come speak. We have a group that meets every week." I said, No. I can't. I don't talk about these things publicly. And where he got me is he said, "People are grieving. People are hurting. The world's aching for this. Come and share your story with this group." And I did so. And it was a group about this size. And there was a fellow in the back that came up that was a publisher. And he says, "You've got to write a book." And I thought, oh, goodness, what have I started now? And he was adamant about this, and I went home still reluctant. By Monday morning, there was a contract on my desk of, "Here's what it looks like if you'll tell your story and write a book." And this was 10 years after the fact, to be honest. So it had been some time. Now, some of the details of the accident and the hospital stay, I had to go back and do research and look at, but the mystical things, the spiritual things, those out-of-body things were like they were yesterday. It was very fresh and constant on my mind. But when I saw this contract, I went back to the scene of the accident, which I had avoided for years. It's a little lonely place, mile marker 80, outside of a little teeny town called Parowan, about 2 hours north of Las Vegas. And given my experience and where I had gone, I asked. I asked the universe, I asked God, am I really supposed to share this story? Am I supposed to write this book? And I got a profound answer. Now, these are the unexplainable things. It was an answer that came so strong I could quote what I was told, and it wasn't a voice from heaven. It wasn't anything I heard with my ears. It was a voice that speaks to the heart. And I was told, share your experience. And if you do, people will heal. Now, it's interesting, the power in those words. Nobody said to tell a story. It was share your experience. And that's simply all I do, is share my experience. I realize it's an experience unique unto me. It was for me. It may have been by me to bring me through a very difficult time. And there's really no agenda in sharing it. I want to be very clear about that. There's no agenda. I will share my experience, and the conclusion is up to anybody. But the experience happened with an automobile accident. And I was happily married, madly in love, to a beautiful woman who was a school teacher. We had 2 sons, beautiful boys, healthy. And we had taken a little road trip for Easter vacation. We were heading back from that. Now, there was reports of crosswinds that were blowing 100 miles an hour. There was reports of a red pickup truck that was driving erratically on the interstate. I had put the cruise control on 75 and was headed back towards Salt Lake City from a little town called St. George down in the Red Rock district of southern Utah. And the most difficult part about the story is I believe I may have dozed off at the wheel for just a moment. Now, when I say that, those words are important too. There's things I believe, and I realize that's just a belief. There's things I hope for, and I also realize that's just hope. But then there's things I know, based in fact. I believe I may have dozed off at the wheel, just briefly, swerved and overcorrected the car and lost control. It began to roll, not off the road, but down the road at 75 miles an hour. I blacked out for most of that, but when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious, super conscious. I mean, it was probably the worst situation of mayhem. The first thing I heard was my 7-year-old son crying in the back seat of the car. And as a father, I thought, well, I've got to get to him. I have got to get to my son. That's when I realized I could not move. I was pinned either to the floorboard or the seat. I was struggling to breathe. I couldn't see very well. And I did feel like I was going to pass out. Now, what had actually happened is that both of my legs had been crushed and shattered. My left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My right leg was a mess and still is pinned together. My back had been broken in a couple of places, but ironically the spinal column not damaged. My rib cage had been crushed. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been torn off. There was no muscle through the rotator cuff or anything still attaching it. And then the seatbelt had cut through my midsection and ruptured my intestines. I was a mess. I was unaware of that. All I knew is I had a little boy crying in that back seat, and I wanted to get to him. And that's when things shifted. In that absolute mayhem, I realized no one else was crying. It was in that moment that I knew that my beloved wife and my youngest son were deceased. And it was more than recognizing, it was feeling it. There was a feeling that, oh my goodness, they're gone. Now that's the worst hell a man could ever be in. You know, I'm pinned, I can't breathe, I've got a child crying, I know half the family's gone, and I was driving the car. In that horror and mayhem, suddenly there was calmness. And I thought, have I lost consciousness? What has happened here? I felt this calmness, and it didn't feel like everything going black like you see in the cartoon. It was as if everything became light. It felt as if I was surrounded by light. It was tangible. And it's as if this light was alive, like it was comforting me, and I began to rise above the scene of this accident. Now, there was beautiful experiences there. As I rose above it and realized I was okay, suddenly my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, was there with me. And that was confusing, except it felt so good to say, wow, we're okay? Except she was saying, you've got to go back, you've got to go back. You can't, no, you've got to go back. Now, that was a moment of choice. And it was a difficult choice. Here I was looking at the woman I loved more than life, yet I knew I had a little boy crying in the back seat of that car, and that was a conscious choice. Here's where I learned the power of our thoughts. Thoughts become things in my experience, and as soon as I made the conscious thought that I'm going back, I found myself wandering around a hospital. And that was interesting too. As I wandered, I encountered all the doctors, nurses, the patients, the families, the people around them. And there was a new knowing about everyone I looked at. I knew them. I knew them perfectly. I knew their love, their hate, their joy, their peace, their decisions, their motivations. It was as if I was connected to them. There was a oneness. I was them. I had grown up in a Christian home and read biblical verse. In fact, as I was having this experience, the famous verse that said, in as much as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me, which I used to think was a nice verse about being kind to people. Well, I was experiencing something different. They were me. They were me. And I thought, well, boy, the wise teacher and master that said that may have known this, that perhaps he saw himself no better as the person in prison or the naked beggar in the street. This connection was unbelievable. Now, this has nothing to do with religion. That was my upbringing. And I realized that our consciousness is affected by our upbringing. But I was having this profound connection to everyone I saw, until I came to a bed where a man was laying, and I felt nothing from that. And in the waves of all this unconditional love I was experiencing and connection, I found that odd. So I stepped closer and looked to realize that was me, or what was my body. I was me. I was here having this profound experience, but there was the skin suit that I had gone through my life into that point. Well, again, thoughts are powerful, and I had the thought to get back in the body. And as soon as I had the conscious thought, I was back in, but then back to all the pain, the grief, the regret, the guilt, the trauma. I was ventilated. I couldn't speak. They had a respirator down doing the work for my lungs. My legs were obviously immobile. My right arm was immobile. They eventually tied down my left arm because I kept grabbing at all the medical equipment. But I learned the meaning of be still. I had nowhere to go. There's nothing I could do, and consciousness became a whole new thing. I would experience my consciousness being in the body, out of the body, in this room, in that room. It was as if I had one foot in this realm and one foot in another realm for many months. I was in ICU for 3 months. I was in the hospital for almost 6 months. They did 18 surgeries in total, putting me back together. I had profound experiences, even in one holding my deceased son, my little toddler son that passed away in the accident, in those other realms. Holding him and kissing him and saying goodbye when I felt as if the whole universe embraced me, and in that moment everything made sense, even though it was mayhem on this realm. It's as if heaven was there. It was as if I was in heaven, holding my little boy and getting to say goodbye. I hesitate to share that because I know how many people lose loved ones and don't get to say goodbye. But I eventually healed. I got well. I was able to come home. I was in a wheelchair. My left leg was lopped off. My right leg was in a brace. My right arm was bound up, but I could drive an electric wheelchair with my left hand. And my surviving son, the little guy that was crying in the back seat of the car, he'd been taken into the home of my younger brother and his wife and looked after. He had visited me in the hospital. But I worried about him. The rough and tumble father that could run up the stairs and tickle him and toss him in the air. Now, all of a sudden, it was going to be different. And my brothers, who were very supportive, they brought me home. They were lifting me out of the car to put me in the wheelchair. I couldn't transfer with one arm and still 2 legs that weren't working. one was gone. But I saw my son looking out the window of the house as they were lifting me out of the car and putting me in the chair, and he came running out as I situated myself and headed toward the ramp my brothers had put together. And he ran toward me, then he ran right past me. And I thought, well, I knew this was going to be hard. I knew this would be rough on him. And I made my way toward the front door and turned to the chair, navigating up the ramp. And that's when I looked to see where he'd went, and I noticed my little son had run across the street and was knocking on all the neighbors' doors. He was saying, come out, my dad has made it home. Come see my dad. In all my shame and grief and guilt, here he was championing my return, and he eventually made his way to me, and he threw himself on my lap, which just about killed me because I still had all the sutures and everything from the abdominal reconstruction. And I wept, and he hugged me, and I said, are you going to be okay with this? I mean, I'm going to be like this for a while. I'll get better. They're going to make me a really cool robot leg, and they'll teach me how to walk again. But for now, it's going to look like this. And he said, Dad, if you were nothing but a puddle of blood, I would still love you. And I held him, and I realized an interesting shift in consciousness. Everything I'd experienced in that other realm, holding my deceased son and saying goodbye in arms that felt so divine and all that perfect love, suddenly it was right there, in a wheelchair, holding my living son. And I realized heaven was right here. Perhaps there was nowhere to go or anything to be, but to open myself up to a higher consciousness of recognizing that perhaps we're more than human. And that by being open to a higher consciousness, perhaps love can flow in a way that shifts everything. Now, I didn't heal immediately. I had years of grief, bereavement, homesickness. I kept looking for all the love I had felt up there, and I expected people like my son to just love me enough to make it okay. Just, be there. I learned to walk. I learned to go back to work. I actually fell in love again, remarried. Beautiful woman who is an earth angel, really. I mean, they come and put the pieces all back together again somehow. We adopted 2 boys, and things appeared to be rolling along normally, but there was still that big empty hole in me saying, what happened? How do I make sense of all that took place? Now, it sustained me, my out-of-body or near-death experiences, and I've realized I may have experienced many of that. I mean, I had the near-death experience. I had the shared death experience in saying goodbye to my deceased son and my deceased wife. I certainly had after-death communication through the process because I would feel them. I would get messages, again, unspoken, but I knew that they were there. In fact, when I fell in love again, that was interesting because I found myself on my wife who had passed's grave, sobbing my eyes out, saying, I don't know what to do. I'm having feelings for another woman. What am I going to do? Where are you? How could you leave me? All of that. And I felt her as if she was right there. Now, I'm sure you could say, well, you made that up. It was your imagination. But for me, it was very real. My experience was she said, of course you are. And I want you to. I can't heal and move on until you do. So live your life, be happy, and choose joy. These things had happened. I would write them down. I would jot them and journal them down, but I would never forget them. They were beyond the commonplace. And that brings me to, today, and what an honor it is to be here where there's research on these things. I was a farm boy. I didn't know what that all meant. I didn't know how to make sense of it. I didn't even know how to align it with my belief system because it didn't. Some of the things I believed were completely turned upside down. I had been taught that there was a God and that God would judge me and life was a test and I was probably in trouble based on how things were going. What I experienced was that there was nothing but pure unconditional love. What I experienced is that we're all different. We all come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different beliefs, different races, but that we're connected. I also experienced that life is a gift. There's no test about it. It's a gift. Every moment is sacred. And we get to choose how to experience that moment. what to do and how to be in that moment. So beliefs kind of shifted. My hope shifted to an absolute trust, just trusting that everything's in perfect order, no matter what it looks like here. And there's still questions. I know what I experience, but there's still questions. How does it work? How does that all happen? You know, how do we bring it together? How do we make sense of it? How do we talk about it in a way that anybody could understand it? But that's what we're here for today. And that's what I'm so thrilled and honored to be here for. If we have consciousness that is not our brain, if we are not necessarily our bodies, and if there's something more, the importance of the research is to embrace that as humankind and embrace the parts of it that aren't necessarily human. To raise the consciousness of the planet, to take a stronger stand for love, for connection, for oneness, for brotherhood, for sisterhood, for humanity. To shift the world. That's what I see the importance of the research. It's to change the world. It's not just about perceptions. It's about creating perceptions into reality, where there's more peace, there's more love, there's more unity. And I'm thrilled. I'm honored to be with you. I'm honored to hear what's going to go on today. I'm giddy, and I'm going to sit down quickly so that we can get to it. But thank you for your time, and thank you for coming and supporting. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for sharing that beautiful, powerful, intense story. It's no doubt life-changing for you and all those people in your life. There are times when I meet someone on this earth and I think, I wish I could give them a near-death experience. Not wishing them death. You got to take that the right way. But to get that kind of perspective on the oneness, so it would be a beautiful thing. But nobody wants to have to suffer like Jeff did to get that. Well, so Jeff mentioned the word shift. We're going to shift from one person's amazing near-death experience to hearing from the man who's probably heard more stories like Jeff's than anyone on this planet. That is not scientifically verifiable, but it's a pretty good guess. Dr. Bruce Grayson, the world expert on near-death experiences. Come on up here, Bruce. Is it true? I think it's got to be true.
Thank you, Pat. As Pat mentioned, one of the phenomena that we have been studying at the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA, University of Virginia, for the past 50 years is near-death experiences, or NDEs, which are similar to the one that you've just heard from Jeff. The concept of near-death experiences has become quite well known in our culture, but not all experiences are like Jeff's, and they're not all the same. There's a core that is similar in all NDEs, but each one is different. Each individual is different. To make it even harder to study near-death experiences, when you ask an experiencer what happened to them, they often start by saying, well, it can't be put into words. There are no words for this. And we researchers say, great, tell me all about it. So we know that by making them put it into words, we're distorting the situation. And we're not studying the experience, we're studying what they tell us about the experience, which is not the same thing. So let me start by giving you a general guideline of how we manage to understand these NDEs. In studying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these, we've come up with 4 different groups of features in near-death experiences. I should also say first that what a near-death experience is not. A near-death experience is not just a close brush with death. Many people, when they come close to death, as Jeff did, report profound experiences, in which they seem to leave their physical bodies and move beyond the boundaries of time and space. NDEs have been reported by many diverse ancient cultures. They appear in the writings of Plato, in the Bible, in the writings of Tibet, India, Egypt, China, Japan, in the folklore of the South Pacific and of Native Americans. The interpretation of the experience may vary from one culture to another, but the basic experience is the same over the centuries and around the globe. These transcendental or mystical experiences that occur near death were written about in the medical literature from the 19th century on. They were described as a discrete syndrome in 1892 by Albert Heim, a Swiss geologist who had one when he fell in the Alps. And in the 1890s, there was a flurry of literature about them in French philosophy journals, in which the term near-death experience was first coined. The term near-death experience in English was popularized by Raymond Moody, who wrote a book in 1975 called Life After Life, which you may have read. And before that book, virtually no one in the Western Hemisphere had heard of a near-death experience. But Moody described about 50 such cases and outlined what he thought were the common features. And that was essentially the model we have. There's been a lot of controversy since then about the interpretation of NDEs, which is partly due to the confusion over the criteria for death. And in fact, it's often very hard to tell when someone is close to death or how close to death they are. However, studies at the University of Virginia, in the United Kingdom, and in Holland have shown that among people who have had documented close brushes with death, for example, with a cardiac arrest, between 10 and 20% will report near-death experiences. That doesn't mean 10 to 20% have them. That means 10 to 20% have them and can remember them and can put them into words and choose to do so. So we have categorized the phenomena of near-death experiences into 4 components: changes in thinking, in thought processes, changes in emotions or feeling, the so-called paranormal features, and the otherworldly features. The first group, the changes in thinking process, include your sense of time being grossly distorted or missing entirely, your thoughts going faster than ever before and often clearer than ever before, a sense of life review or panoramic memory where your whole life may come back to you in a flash, and a sense of sudden understanding or revelation. Let me give you a brief example. A 44-year-old man standing on a ladder, leaning against his house, suddenly fell backward. He described this changes in his thinking as follows: ensnared in a backward sliding ladder, the actual fall slowed way down, almost like a series of camera still pictures being taken, a click, click sort of visual progression. During the next few seconds, or fractions thereof, I was unaware of any bodily sensations, but rather saw my life flash before me in a series of typical scenes. And this slowing up dramatically increased my thinking speed, so that I was able to size up how I could maneuver the ladder and not end up on the flagstones from 2 stories up. Not only did the fall slow way down, but my thinking became very, very clear in split seconds. I remember wanting to head for the shrubs, which, though they might pierce my skin, would break my fall. So those are the changes in thinking that are typical of a near-death experience. There are also changes in feeling or emotion, which include an overwhelming sense of peace or well-being, feelings of joy, a sense of cosmic unity or oneness with everything, and an encounter with the bright light which often is characterized by this unconditional love that Jeff mentioned. A 74-year-old woman described the emotional changes in her NDE during a heart attack in this way. She said, "I seemed to be floating in a more or less confined space. but there were no walls as we know them. I was moving in and out of a billowing, soft, dark, purple velvety substance. It was beautiful, sensual, voluptuous, sort of like falling into a great mass of soft satin and down feathers. I was completely surrounded by this substance, and I floated up and down restfully. Each time I got near the bottom, I could see a great brightness at the end of this space. The brightness was warm, soft, and so welcoming. I didn't seem to have a body or a mind. I didn't seem to be a person or even a thing. I was peaceful, happy, contented. I didn't seem to care about anything anymore. It was not a feeling you can put into words. No mind, no body, no boundaries, only contentment. Sort of like an amoeba that had gotten into the ocean by mistake. So those are the typical changes in feeling. In addition, there are what seem to be paranormal features during the NDE. Your normal physical senses of vision, hearing, smell, touch are much more vivid and much more acute than they ever were before. You may see colors that you've never seen on Earth, hear sounds that you've never heard. They have frank extrasensory perception, visions of the future, and a sense of leaving the physical body. A 26-year-old woman who had a pulmonary embolism described her paranormal features as follows. I drifted out of the body and hovered near the ceiling. I viewed the activity in the room from this vantage point. It confused me that the doctors and nurses in the room were so concerned about the body they had lifted on the bed. I tried to tell them I was not in the body. Obviously, they didn't hear me. One of the most outstanding things about this experience is that my hearing became extremely acute. I heard many things about the gravity of my situation, some of them coming from the nurses' station many yards away. I watched the hospital personnel work. I listened to their comments, and I began to feel sorry for them because they were working so hard when I felt so happy and I was feeling no pain where I was. So those are the paranormal features. In addition, there are what seem to be otherworldly features of the NDE, finding yourself in some type of mystical or unearthly realm of existence, encountering some mystical being or presence, seeing deceased spirits or religious spirits, and finally coming to a border or point of no return beyond which you can't return to life. A 26-year-old woman who had an emergency cesarean section reported her otherworldly features in this way. She said, I heard my doctor say, I've lost her, she's gone. Then an angel was carrying me through a huge, great auditorium. The two large doors of the auditorium opened, and we went out and up through space. I saw a beautiful white city with a wall around it and a set of gates facing me. As we got closer, I heard excited voices. They were questioning why the angel was bringing me now. She was unperturbed by the excitement and continued to approach the gates. I heard one of them say, she knows it is not her time. Why is she bringing her here now? And another one said to the angel, it's not her time. She can't come in. All of a sudden, I found myself back on the operating table. My doctor said, I'm so glad you're back. I was crying as if my heart would break, telling him I didn't want to come back. I begged him to let me go again. It was so beautiful. It was the saddest time of my life, and yet it was the most beautiful. I've described these four snippets of NDEs to illustrate the changes in thinking, changes in feeling, the paranormal, and the otherworldly features. But in fact, most NDEs have some of all of these features in them. And not all NDEs have one or two of these. They're all different. One of the problems we have in studying near-death experiences is that all our research is retrospective. That is, we start with someone now, today, who's telling us about an experience they had in the past. So we have to reconstruct what happened. Now, NDEers will typically say, as you may have heard Jeff say, is like it happened yesterday. The vividness has not gone away at all. But we know that our memories are faulty, and we distort things over time. So how do we know that the memories of NDEs are accurate? Some skeptics claim that these are all embellishments, that the longer time passes after the NDE, the more elaborate it gets, and particularly the more blissful it gets with retelling over time. Because we've been studying these NDEs for 5 decades now, we're able to address this question. Starting in 2002, I began tracking down people whom I had interviewed about their NDEs in the early 1980s and asking them to again describe to me their NDEs just as they had 20 years earlier. And we found something very interesting. These are scores. The green scores are what people told me in the 1980s, and the red bars are what they told me in the 2000s. And the first column the first column is the total depth of the NDE on a scale that we use. And as you can see, it's virtually the same 20 years later. Certainly not embellished. It may be slightly less, but statistically the same. The next bars are for changes in thinking, changes in feeling, paranormal phenomena, and the transcendental aspects. And in each case, the reports are the same after 20 years. So what this means is that NDE memories are reliable over time, and therefore retrospective research is reliable. Another important question about these retrospective research studies is that all our experiences are influenced by our cultural beliefs. And how do we know whether these NDE reports are just determined by what you expect is going to happen to you? We know that most of our experiences are influenced by culture. For example, many people in the West will talk about going through a tunnel. People in third world countries where there aren't a lot of tunnels don't talk about that. But they will say it went into a cave or into a well. One near-death experiencer I interviewed who was a truck driver talked about being sucked into a tailpipe. So the phenomenon is the same of going through a long, dark, enclosed space to get to this other realm, but you describe it with whatever cultural metaphor is available to you. So are NDEers just reporting what they expect to have happen? The dominant model in the West for the past 40 years has been Raymond Moody's. But at UVA, University of Virginia, we've been collecting these reports from the early 1960s, many years before Moody wrote his book, telling us what we're supposed to have happen in the NDE. We compared 24 of the best cases we had from before 1975 when Moody wrote his book, with 24 cases from the last decade matched in terms of age, race, gender, religion, religiosity, how they came close to death, and how close to death they came. And what we found was, again, essentially no difference. The green bars are the reports we collected before Moody wrote his book, and the red bars are accounts we collected in the last decade. And you can see with out-of-body experiences, feelings of peace, meeting other entities, being of light, hearing music or noise, life review, all statistically the same before Moody wrote his book, telling us what we're supposed to experience, and after. Moody also wrote about the after effects, so we asked about those as well. And again, the green bar is before Moody wrote his book, and the red bar is after. Every experiencer in both samples, 100% of them reported dramatic attitude changes. They also reported, all the bars aren't labeled there, but they also reported less fear of death, having difficulty telling other people, increased belief in survival, and people corroborating what they experienced out of body. If they said, I saw this happen, people said, yes, that really happened. With equal frequency after Moody wrote his book and before Moody wrote his book. So the NDE reports are not influenced by the widespread public knowledge of Moody's model. although the interpretation of NDEs may be influenced by your culture, what metaphors you use to describe it. The basic experience is not determined by your culture. So how do we explain these experiences? No variables that we've studied yet are able to predict whether you're going to have an NDE or what kind you're going to have. We've looked at age, gender, race, religion, religiosity, history of mental illness, and none of those things are associated with NDEs or a specific type of NDE. There's been a lot of speculation about physiological causes that may be related to the NDE, lack of oxygen, endorphins, temporal lobe seizures. The bottom line with all these explanations, though, is that you can't reconcile the enhanced mental functioning, the heightened perceptions, the faster thinking, the clearer thinking, the deep, detailed memories with the fact that the brain is not functioning. So why should we care about these NDEs? One reason is that they usually lead to a consistent pattern of changes in attitudes, beliefs, and values. And we've studied these and confirmed them with long-term studies of NDEers over decades, and also by interviews with their significant others. So it's not just the NDEer telling us that, it's their husbands and their wives and their children telling us as well. And we find that there are a lot of attitudes that are consistently increased after our near-death experiences. We see dramatic increases in spirituality, in compassion and concern for other people, in appreciation for life, in a sense of meaning or purpose in life, in confidence and flexibility in your being able to cope with stressors, in belief in survival after death. Now, some of these things will happen to anybody who comes close to death. For example, an appreciation of life is usually enhanced no matter who they are if they've come close to death. But others, such as the constant confidence in being able to cope and belief in postmortem survival, are unique to NDEers. People who come close to death but don't have NDEs don't have these things. In addition to these attitudes that are increased, there are attitudes that are decreased consistently after an NDE. NDEers consistently report decreased or totally absent fear of death. They report decreased interest in material possessions, in physical things, decreased interest in personal status, power, prestige, fame, and decreased interest in competition, more interest in collaboration and altruistic activities than in competitive activities. Sometimes these changes are so marked that the experiencers seem to be different people than they were before the NDE. A second reason that we should be interested in NDEs is for what they tell us about the possibility of survival after death. As Pat mentioned, the Division of Perceptual Studies was founded in part to explore the possibility that something about us survives bodily death. And near-death experiences do provide some evidence bearing on that. Is death the end of existence? Or is death just a change of state? So what about the near-death experience bears on the question of whether we survive death? First, there was the enhanced mental functioning, thinking faster and clearer than ever before when your brain is not functioning. And one example of this is Pam Reynolds, who had a huge aneurysm at the base of her brain that couldn't be operated on because to get to that would would burst it and she would bleed to death. So they did an experimental procedure with her, experimental then, now it's more commonly used, where they cooled her body down to 60 degrees and drained all the blood out of her body so you can go in and cut the aneurysm without risking her bleeding to death. So she was without any blood going to her brain, no blood in her body at all, for about an hour. It took longer than they thought to do this procedure for various reasons, so they had to cool her body and replace the blood faster than they wanted to. And as a result, her heart stopped twice as they were trying to bring her back. Her brain was being monitored for the whole procedure, and there was no electrical activity in her brain, so we know she was having no brain function. And yet she reported a very detailed near-death experience, reporting accurately things going on in the surgery room, some things that she found interesting, sometimes things she found offensive in the room, and she reported meeting deceased loved ones who told her she had to go back. So this is something that you can't explain in a materialistic model, that the mind is what the brain does. You have no brain function and you have enhanced mind function. Secondly, you have accurate perceptions from an out-of-body perspective. If you're in your body, how can you see things accurately from outside? One of my favorite examples is Al Sullivan from Hartford, Connecticut. He's a truck driver who had quadruple bypass surgery. And in the surgery, he left his body and looked down, and as he described it, his surgeon was flapping his arms as if he was trying to fly. That's not something you'd think of a surgeon doing during surgery. Not something they show you in television shows about surgery. So Al asked the surgeon when he recovered about that, and the surgeon got very angry and said, "Who told you about that?" Al said, "Well, I was watching you." The surgeon got very defensive and said, "Well, I must have done something right because you're here, aren't you?" I interviewed the surgeon myself, because in my medical career, I'd never seen a surgeon do anything like that. And he explained that he would let his interns start the procedure, and then he would scrub in, get his hands sterile, put on the sterile gloves, and then go in to supervise them. And he didn't want to risk touching anything that was not in the sterile field with his sterile gloves, so he put them where he knew they wouldn't get into trouble. And then he would supervise, pull over there more, a little more, cut over here a little more. So we have lots of examples of these accurate out-of-body perceptions. In fact, Jan Holden at the University of North Texas looked up, I think she found 107 cases, published cases, of out-of-body perceptions that were potentially corroboratable. And more than 90% were entirely accurate, no mistakes at all, including 90% of those that were corroborated by someone else other than the experiencer. So we definitely have accurate perceptions when you're not in the body. Third, we have information that was given to people during a near-death experience from deceased loved ones that they see. Often when near-death experiencers say, "I saw my grandmother," the skeptics say, "That's just wishful thinking. Of course you would." But sometimes they tell us information we couldn't have gotten in any other way. For example, there are several cases of the deceased people telling the near-death experiencer where something was hidden, an important document, an important treasure. There's a great case from Pliny the Elder in something like 30 BC describing a case like this, where someone told his brother who was having a near-death experience where the money was hidden. In some cases, the deceased person that the near-death experiencer sees is someone who was not known to be dead. And these are cases that cannot be dismissed easily as wishful thinking. In one typical case from our files, an elderly woman was surrounded on her deathbed by her grandchildren. And she seemed to be slipping away, but then she suddenly opened her eyes and became very alert and said excitedly, "Oh, Will, are you here?" And then she died. There was no one named Will in the room. And the family was trying to figure out who was she talking about. The only Will they could think of was their great uncle, her brother, who lived in England. Not long after her death, they received word that he had died 2 days earlier. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross told a story about a young girl who was an only child who almost died during heart surgery. And she said that in her near-death experiences, she met someone who identified himself as her brother. When she told her father about this, he was so moved that he confessed to her that he had, in fact, had a son who died before she was born, and she was never told about him. We've identified dozens of cases of these type, again dating back to ancient Greece, that just can't be explained in terms of a materialistic model. The bottom line is that near-death experiences suggest that mind and brain are not the same thing, that mind seems to function quite well when the brain is not, in fact, maybe better when the brain is not functioning, and that we need to question some of our basic assumptions about not only mind and brain, but the universe and our role in it.